The clatter of a breakfast tray hitting steel echoed through the narrow passageway as Seaman Charlie Garcia cursed at spilled coffee, laughing with the oldest gunner in the division, Walt Gardner, whose wife had just mailed a snapshot of their newborn son. There was nothing threatening in the world except the rising sun and the endless chores of a destroyer on escort duty. The men had spent days rehearsing torpedo drill, but right now, thoughts wandered to letters from home and the shrill voice of the cook demanding they hurry to chow. On the bridge, Commander Ernest Evans's hands clenched on the brass rail. Yesterday, he had told his crew, with a grin that seemed to cut through worry, "This is a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way." No one doubted he meant it. But that morning, even Evans paused to look at a battered pocket Bible before tossing it onto his desk. The mood among his officers was half expectation, half joke. Another day, another patrol, nothing new. Suddenly, the radar operator yelled. The screen was painted with bright, solid blips. "Unidentified contacts, Captain. Count at least 12 ships, big ones. Range closing." An instant later, the world exploded into motion. Running feet hammered overheads and steel decks. A lookout screamed. Through his binoculars, the shape grew monster-like on the horizon. No one had ever seen the Yamato up close, and none imagined the largest battleship on Earth could be charging straight toward them. Guns already turning. The sky, just moments earlier, serene and painted orange, fractured by the thunder of distant shellfire. Evans barked, "General quarters!" and men stormed to battle stations, faces pale, sweat springing even in the morning chill. Gardner shoved Garcia toward the 5-inch gun, muttering a prayer for his son. Random thoughts flashed, a birthday missed, a promise broken, what it would mean if these few seconds were their last. Evans's gaze was fierce. He did not blink. Over the intercom, his voice drove every man to readiness. "We will do our duty. The enemy will not pass." All eyes locked onto him. The 12 ships in the distance were advancing relentlessly, their hulls massive, bristling with turrets. This was not a fair fight. The deck shuddered as the Johnston turned hard, her engines straining, bow aiming directly into the mouth of hell. The first enemy salvo landed close, geysers ripping the sea just meters off port. Garcia, white-knuckled, realized there was nowhere to run. There were no more jokes or casual glances at photographs. In the span of a heartbeat, every soul aboard understood what they faced. For a single moment, the smallest destroyer in the fleet was the only barrier against annihilation. And then, without hesitation, Evans ordered the attack. Ernest Evans stood on the bridge with his jaw locked tight and his mind running through calculations no sane officer would ever attempt. The mathematics were simple and brutal. His destroyer weighed 2,000 tons. The Japanese battleship Yamato, now clearly visible through the smoke and chaos, displaced 70,000 tons and carried guns that fired shells heavier than a small car. One direct hit would vaporize the Johnston. 20 hits were already guaranteed if he continued this insane charge. But Evans had made a promise the day Johnston was commissioned. He told his crew then, standing on the deck with his hand on the rail, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who does not want to go along had better get off right now." No one got off. Now, with the enemy fleet closing and his carriers defenseless behind him, Evans faced the ultimate test of that promise. He did not ask permission. He did not wait for orders from Admiral Sprague or anyone else. At 7:10 in the morning, with Japanese shells already bracketing his ship, Evans turned to his officers and said the words that would define the next hour. "All hands to general quarters. Prepare to attack major portion of the Japanese fleet." His voice carried over the intercom to every compartment, every gun station, every terrified sailor below. "All engines ahead, flank. Commence making smoke and stand by for a torpedo attack. Left full rudder." The men froze for half a second, brains struggling to process what they had just heard. Attack the entire Japanese center force? Alone? Gunnery Officer Robert Hagan felt his stomach drop. He later described Evans as a captain who could strike fighting spirit from his men the way steel strikes spark from flint. But even Hagen wondered if this time the spark had turned into wildfire that would consume them all. Down in the engine room, Chief Machinist Mate Harold Ellison pushed the throttles to the stops. The Johnston surged forward, her hull shuddering as turbines screamed and black smoke poured from her stacks. On deck, torpedo crews scrambled to arm the 10 torpedoes that represented their only chance to hurt the giants bearing down on them. The range was 35,000 yards. To launch torpedoes, they needed to close to 10,000 yards. 5 miles. 5 miles of open water under direct fire from the most powerful naval guns on the planet. Evans knew the odds. He did not care. His face was stone, but inside, a cold fury burned. These Japanese ships intended to slaughter the escort carriers behind him, carriers filled with pilots and crew who had no armor, no speed, no chance. Johnston had speed. Johnston had torpedoes. Johnston had a crew that trusted him beyond reason. The first salvo from the Japanese cruiser Kumano fell short, throwing up geysers that drenched the forward deck. The second salvo landed closer. Hagen opened fire with the 5-inch guns, knowing they were almost useless at this range, but needing to do something, anything, to answer the thunder rolling toward them. Shells screamed overhead. The sky turned into a nightmare of smoke, fire, and the scream of incoming rounds that sounded like freight trains ripping through the air. Evans did not flinch. He stood on the bridge, hands gripping the rail, eyes locked on the enemy. Around him, young officers watched their captain and found courage they did not know they possessed. If Evans believed they could survive this, then maybe, just maybe, they could. The range closed. 30,000 yards, 25,000. The Johnston twisted and turned, chasing salvos, using every trick Evans had drilled into them. A 14-inch shell from the battleship Congo landed so close that it sprayed red dye across Johnston's hull, but did not explode. Men on deck were soaked in crimson water and thought for a horrifying instant that it was blood. 10,000 yards. Evans gave the order. "Fire torpedoes!" All 10 torpedoes leaped from their tubes and raced toward the heavy cruiser Kumano. The Johnston immediately turned hard, diving into her own smoke, praying the curtain would hide them long enough to escape. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, through the smoke and chaos, a massive explosion erupted on Kumano's bow. At least one torpedo, maybe more, had struck home. The cruiser's entire forward section disintegrated, forcing her out of the fight. The crew erupted in wild cheers, but Evans silenced them with a bark. This was not over. The Japanese fleet was still coming, and now every gun was trained on the tiny destroyer that had just bloodied their formation. Evans turned Johnston south, racing back toward the carriers, still making smoke, still firing, still defiant. Lieutenant Hagen would later say that what came next was the most courageous order he ever heard. Evans saw the escort carrier Gambier Bay taking hits, her thin skin no match for Japanese cruiser shells. Without hesitation, Evans spoke into the intercom. "Commence firing on that cruiser. Draw her fire on us, and away from Gambier Bay." He ordered his ship to shield a carrier by offering Johnston as bait. The men understood instantly. They opened fire, shells screaming toward the Japanese cruiser, and the enemy responded exactly as Evans predicted. Guns swung toward Johnston. Salvos that would have killed Gambier Bay now focused on the destroyer that refused to die. Evans had made his decision. His ship, his crew, his sacrifice. The first shell from the battleship Yamato arrived at 7:30 in the morning and changed everything. It was an 18-inch shell, the largest naval gun in existence, and it weighed more than a compact car. When it struck Johnston aft, below the waterline, the entire ship convulsed as if a giant fist had punched through her hull. The explosion ripped through the after engine room, demolished the reduction gear, and killed every man in that compartment instantly. A second shell followed a heartbeat later, tearing into the after turbine. The third shell obliterated the number 4 boiler in a blast of superheated steam and shrapnel that turned steel into shredded metal. In the span of 5 seconds, Johnston lost half her power. Her speed dropped from 30 knots to 17. The aft gun mounts, numbers 3, 4, and 5, were blown apart or severed from power. Men who had been joking minutes earlier were dead or dying, their bodies broken by the violence of the impacts. On the bridge, Commander Evans felt the ship shudder beneath him. Then the secondary battery from Yamato opened fire. 6-inch shells screamed in, smaller than the monsters that had just gutted his engine room, but no less deadly. One shell tore into the bridge itself. The blast threw Evans against the bulkhead, shrapnel slicing through the air like 1,000 razors. When he pulled himself upright, his left hand was a mangled wreck. 2 fingers were gone, severed cleanly. Blood poured down his arm, soaking his uniform. Around him, men were screaming. The torpedo director was destroyed. Half the bridge crew were casualties, some dead, others clutching wounds that would kill them in minutes. Evans did not stop. He wrapped his ruined hand in a torn piece of cloth, his face pale, but his voice steady. "Damage report! Get me damage control!" The intercom crackled with chaos. Reports flooded in. Engine room flooded. Boiler room wrecked. Gyro compass destroyed. Steering control lost on the bridge. The list went on and on, each word a hammer blow to any hope of survival. But Evans refused to yield. He staggered to his feet, ignoring the agony in his hand, and gave orders with the same iron authority he had always commanded. "Transfer steering control to aft. All remaining guns, keep firing. We are not done yet." He abandoned the shattered bridge and moved to the fantail, where men were manually turning the rudder by hand, shouting coordinates through an open hatch because all electronic systems were dead. Johnston limped into a rain squall, using the brief cover to catch her breath. Repair crews swarmed over the damage, hauling ammunition by hand because the hoists were destroyed, patching holes with whatever they could find, knowing it was hopeless, but doing it anyway because Evans demanded it, and they would not fail him. The ship emerged from the squall, still fighting, still moving, still defiant. At 7:50, Admiral Sprague gave the order that would seal Johnston's fate. Small boys attack. It meant the destroyers were to charge again, to throw themselves at the Japanese fleet one more time. Johnston had no torpedoes left. She was crippled, bleeding, barely able to move. But when the other destroyers surged forward, Johnston joined them. She opened fire on a Congo-class battleship at 7,000 yards, point-blank range for capital ships. Her 5-inch guns hammered shells into the giant, drawing fire away from the other destroyers. The battleship turned its massive guns on Johnston. Shells landed all around her, geysers erupting, shrapnel raining down. One shell punched through the supply office. Another destroyed the emergency radio. A third tore into the forward section, killing more men, wrecking more systems. Seaman Garcia, who had spilled coffee that morning, was manning a gun that no longer had power. He and his crew were feeding shells by hand, their arms burning with exhaustion, their ears bleeding from the concussions. Walt Gardner, the old gunner who had shown everyone the picture of his newborn son, was hit by shrapnel. It tore through his chest, and he collapsed against the mount, blood spreading across the deck. His last words were a whisper. "Tell my boy I fought." Johnston turned her guns on a formation of Japanese destroyers, threatening the carrier Gambier Bay. She had no business engaging destroyers in her condition. But Evans saw Gambier Bay taking hits and made the decision instantly. "Commence firing on those destroyers. Draw their fire." Johnston's remaining guns roared. The Japanese destroyers, stunned that this crippled wreck was still fighting, turned their weapons on her. Torpedoes missed by meters. Shells pounded into Johnston's hull. At 9:10, 3 shells struck simultaneously. One detonated in the coding room, obliterating Radio Central and the communications nerve center. Another smashed into the forward fire room, flooding it and killing the last engine. Johnston went dead in the water. The third shell ripped open the hull below the waterline. Water poured in, dragging the destroyer lower. The Japanese fleet closed in. A heavy cruiser moved to within 1,000 yards, point-blank execution range, and opened fire. Shells tore through Johnston's thin hull like paper. Fires erupted, the deck buckled. Men were thrown overboard by the impacts or burned alive in compartments they could not escape. The ship began to list, her bow dipping lower as flooding overwhelmed the pumps. Evans, standing on the fantail with his shattered hand pressed against his side, looked at the faces of the men around him. Boys. Most of them were just boys. They had followed him into hell without hesitation, and now hell was claiming them. He gave the order he had prayed he would never have to give. Abandon ship. Men scrambled over the sides, jumping into an ocean churned by explosions and stained with oil. Some clung to debris. Others swam for life rafts that were already overcrowded. Evans helped push men over the rail, shouting encouragement, refusing to leave until the last possible moment. At 10:10 in the morning, Johnston rolled onto her side. Her hull groaned, a sound like a dying animal, and she began to sink. As she slipped beneath the waves, a Japanese destroyer, the Yukikaze, came alongside at 1,000 yards. Instead of firing, the Japanese crew lined the rails and saluted. They had never seen anything like Johnston. They had never seen a ship refuse to die. Evans was last seen climbing into a life raft, his face gray with blood loss, his eyes still fierce. Then the raft drifted into the smoke and chaos, and he was gone. The water was black and thick with fuel oil, It coated everything, filled mouths, burned eyes, turned men into unrecognizable shapes, clinging to debris in a sea that had become a graveyard. 141 men from Johnston survived the sinking. 186 did not. The survivors clung to 3 life rafts and 2 floater nets, their bodies broken, their uniforms shredded, their hope bleeding away with every passing hour. Seaman Charlie Garcia floated in his life jacket, his hands gripping a piece of shattered decking, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Hours earlier, he had been laughing over spilled coffee. Now Walt Gardner was dead, the ship was gone, and the ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. The oil made him gag. Every breath tasted of death. Around him, men called out names, searching for friends, for officers, for anyone who could tell them what to do next. Lieutenant Robert Hagen pulled himself onto a raft overcrowded with wounded men. His ears still rang from the explosions. Blood streamed from a gash on his forehead. He tried to count the survivors, but gave up when the numbers refused to make sense. Too many faces were missing. Too many voices silenced. He scanned the debris field, searching desperately for Commander Evans, but the captain was nowhere to be seen. Then someone shouted. A small boat drifted into view, and in it sat Evans, his left hand wrapped in blood-soaked bandages, his face gray with shock and blood loss. He was helping other men climb aboard, his voice still commanding despite his wounds. "Get everyone together, stay calm, rescue will come." Hagen felt a surge of relief so powerful it almost broke him. If Evans was alive, they could survive this. But as night fell on October 25th, hope began to fracture. The water was warm, but not warm enough. Men shivered uncontrollably as their core temperatures dropped. The wounded screamed or fell silent, their injuries too severe for the makeshift first aid the survivors could provide. One sailor, his leg shattered by shrapnel, begged for morphine they did not have. Another, burned across half his body, slipped beneath the waves without a sound. And then the sharks arrived. The first attack came without warning. A man on the edge of a floater net disappeared with a scream that cut off abruptly. The water thrashed. Blood spread in dark clouds. Panic seized the survivors. Men scrambled toward the center of the rafts, pulling their limbs out of the water, eyes wide with terror. Garcia watched a shark circle his piece of debris, its fin cutting the surface like a blade. He pulled his legs up and held perfectly still, praying it would pass. It did not pass. Throughout the night, the sharks returned again and again. Men who drifted away from the rafts in exhaustion or delirium were taken. Some were pulled under so quickly there was no time to react. Others fought, thrashing and screaming, their struggles only drawing more predators. The survivors who remained could do nothing but watch and pray they were not next. Hagen kept a mental count of the losses, but after the 10th man disappeared, he stopped counting. It was too much. The darkness, the screams, the constant fear that the next attack would claim him. He focused on keeping men together, on tying the weakest to the rafts, so they could not drift away. But exhaustion was winning. Men fell asleep and slipped beneath the surface. Others simply gave up, letting go of the rafts and sinking without protest. On the morning of October 26th, a plane appeared overhead. The survivors erupted in desperate shouts, waving arms, splashing water, anything to draw attention. The plane circled once, twice, then flew away. Silence fell like a hammer. No one spoke. The realization that rescue might not come broke something inside them. Hagen saw men weeping openly, their hope shattered. Hours dragged into eternity. The sun burned exposed skin until it blistered and cracked. Thirst became a torture worse than the wounds. Men hallucinated, seeing ships that did not exist, hearing voices calling from empty water. Some drank seawater despite warnings and died vomiting and convulsing. Garcia watched a friend lose his mind, laughing hysterically, before slipping beneath the waves with a smile on his face. Evans remained in his small boat, his condition deteriorating rapidly. The blood loss and shock were killing him slowly. Men who swam to his boat later said he was delirious, speaking to people who were not there, giving orders to a ship that no longer existed. On the night of the 25th, he was last seen lying in the boat, his breathing shallow, his eyes unfocused. By dawn on the 26th, the boat had drifted away, lost in the vastness of the ocean. No one ever saw Commander Ernest Evans again. 50 hours. 50 hours in the water. 50 hours of sharks, dehydration, hallucinations, and death. Men who had survived the most vicious naval battle in history were dying in silence, forgotten in an empty sea. Hagen stopped believing in rescue. He focused only on the next breath, the next minute, the next wave. Survival became a reflex, nothing more. On October 27th, at noon, exactly 1 year to the hour after Johnston had been commissioned, a small landing craft appeared on the horizon. It was an LCI gunboat, part of a rescue task force that had been searching the battle area for 2 days. The survivors, too weak to shout, fired a flare. The gunboat turned toward them. Hagen watched the boat approach, his vision blurred, his body shutting down. He could not feel relief. He could not feel anything. Men were hauled aboard, their bodies limp, their eyes hollow. Garcia was pulled from the water unconscious, his skin burned raw, his hands still gripping the piece of decking. Of the 141 men who survived the sinking, several died on the rescue ship, their bodies finally giving out after enduring too much. The LCI gunboat turned toward shore, its decks crowded with broken men who had fought a battle no one would believe. Behind them, the ocean stretched empty and silent, holding its secrets 2 miles beneath the surface, where Johnston rested in darkness. The survivors sat in silence on the deck of the rescue ship, wrapped in blankets, their eyes hollow. No one spoke about what they had endured. The words did not exist to describe 50 hours in the water, watching friends die, feeling hope drain away, drop by drop. Lieutenant Robert Hagen stared at his hands, unable to process that he was still alive. Seaman Charlie Garcia sat apart from the others, his mind replaying the moment Walt Gardner died, the photograph of his newborn son still clutched in the old gunner's hand. They learned the truth slowly, in fragments. The battle off Samar had been won. Against impossible odds, the escort carriers had survived. The Japanese fleet, despite its overwhelming power, had retreated. Admiral Kurita, commanding the most powerful surface force in the Pacific, had turned away from a defenseless invasion fleet he could have annihilated. The survivors did not understand. How? Why? The answer was Johnston, and Samuel B. Roberts, and Howell, and Heermann, and the destroyers and destroyer escorts that had charged into certain death without hesitation. The Japanese admirals, battered by the ferocious attacks, believed they were facing a much larger force. They saw destroyers fighting like battleships, launching torpedoes at point-blank range, absorbing damage that should have sunk them instantly, but continuing to fight. They saw ships that refused to die, and they broke. But for the survivors of Johnston, there was no celebration, only grief. 186 men were gone. Commander Ernest Evans was missing, declared lost at sea. The ship that had been their home, their fortress, their identity, rested in darkness at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. The survivors were scattered to hospitals, to new assignments, to lives that would never again feel whole. On April 17, 1945, President Harry Truman signed the order posthumously awarding Commander Ernest E. Evans the Medal of Honor. The citation described his actions in language that seemed too small to capture what had happened. Gallantly diverted the powerful blasts of hostile guns from the lightly armed and armored carriers under his protection, outmaneuvering and outshooting the enemy as he consistently interposed his vessel between the hostile fleet units and our carriers. Ernest Evans became the first Native American in United States Navy history to receive the Medal of Honor. He would never know. His body was never recovered. Somewhere in the depths, in the darkness, more than 4 miles beneath the surface, he rested with his ship. But the legend did not die. The story spread through the fleet like wildfire. Sailors who had not been at Samar heard about the destroyer that charged battleships alone. Marines landing on Iwo Jima heard about the captain who wrapped his shattered hand and kept fighting. Pilots flying over Tokyo heard about the crew that refused to surrender even when their ship was dead in the water. Johnston became more than a ship. She became a symbol. And then, decades later, something extraordinary emerged from Japanese records. In the chaos of the battle, as Johnston sank beneath the waves, the destroyer Yukikaze passed close by. Her captain, observing the American sailors in the water, ordered his crew to line the rails. The Japanese sailors stood at attention, and they saluted. This was not common. This was not protocol. This was respect, the kind of respect warriors give to warriors who have earned it through blood and courage. The Japanese captain later wrote that he believed he was watching a cruiser sink, not a destroyer. Johnston had fought so ferociously, absorbed so much punishment, inflicted so much damage, that the enemy thought she was 3 times her actual size. In the years after the war, survivors gathered annually. They told their stories to children and grandchildren who struggled to believe them. How could a single destroyer change the course of a battle? How could 327 men hold off an entire fleet? The survivors did not have good answers. They only knew what they had seen. They had seen Commander Evans turn his ship toward impossible odds without hesitation. They had seen men fight until their guns were silent and their ship was sinking. They had seen courage that defied logic. Robert Hagan lived until 2004. In every interview, he said the same thing. The skipper was a fighting man from the soles of his broad feet to the ends of his straight black hair. He was an inspiration to all of us. Charlie Garcia never spoke publicly about the battle. He kept a single photograph in his wallet until the day he died. It was not a picture of himself. It was the photograph of Walt Gardner's newborn son, salvaged from the water by another survivor and given to Garcia years later. On March 31, 2021, 77 years after Johnston sank, a deep-sea exploration team found her. She rested at 21,180 feet beneath the surface, the deepest shipwreck ever located. The hull was shattered, torn apart by the violence she had endured, but the bow was intact. Her identification number, 557, was still visible. The explorers photographed the wreck and left it undisturbed, a war grave protected by international law. The images were transmitted to the surface and shared with the world. Millions of people saw Johnston for the first time. They saw the twisted gun mounts, the shattered superstructure, the evidence of a ship that had been beaten to pieces but had not surrendered. They saw the final resting place of 186 men who had given everything. And in those images, something else was visible. On the fantail, where Commander Evans had stood giving orders with his ruined hand, the deck was scorched and buckled. But the flagstaff remained upright. 77 years in crushing darkness had not broken it. The flag itself was long gone, dissolved by time and pressure. But the staff stood. Johnston had never surrendered, and even in death she refused to bow.